Thank you everyone for tuning into this episode of Voices from the Field, which is a series of conversations we're hosting in connection with the Localization Action Guide. And it features people with hands-on experience building healthy economies, direct democracy, and human scale economies. In this episode, we have a twofold focus. We'll be looking at what it takes to create a community space and what it means to work towards localization in multiple sectors of the economy, not just local food, local energy, local business, but all of that at once. Our guest is Chris Wood, who's the founder and director of the Vermont-based group BALE, which stands for Building a Local Economy. Chris also serves on numerous community boards and has founded or co-founded several nonprofit organizations over the last several decades. And I've known Chris for probably 20 years or maybe more, and we've collaborated on a few projects in the past, including a major conference in 2017, for which BALE was the host and lead organizer. Chris, welcome, and thanks for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Before you tell us about BALE and what kinds of activities you're involved in, can you give everyone a quick orientation to the area you serve? We were actually talking a little bit earlier about watersheds and different definitions of what an area is, but we have participants on this call that are not from the US and may not know anything about Vermont. So if you can sort of provide a little context for where your work happens.
Yep. The work of BALE, as we defined it when we started, was the White River watershed of Vermont. The White River watershed of Vermont is a primarily rural agricultural, primarily agricultural area with small towns. The town that we've based our activity from is South Royalton, and that has a large population of 3,000, under 3,000 people. So that, and then typically the watershed itself is about 14 towns. And of course, Vermont in general, as a state in New England, is commonly described as a rural state, has a couple of slightly larger towns, primarily Burlington being the larger city. And even our state capital, Montpelier, has a population of like 8,000 people. So small scale, probably on many levels. And you know, and as I would say, as we get into this conversation, advantageous to the way we are able to operate, especially in the multi-sector kind of field, but we can get into that later.
Yeah. Yeah, before we get to the multi-sector localization, let's start with the community space, which is where we've highlighted BALE in the Localization Action Guide. And Carly has some photos that she can screen share so that people, as you're describing the space, people will get a chance to see it. And I should mention that Chris is at that space right now.
Yeah, I'm in that. This was back at 2 years ago as we were entering the COVID phase, but it still looks the same. It's got snow around it now. And I'm actually sitting in the window next to the thank you sign right now, which, as one of our first activities, was we started a community radio station. So the radio booth was technically right where I am sitting now. It has outgrown our little space, so the community radio station now lives a block away. But so that's our storefront. It's downtown. It faces the green. It's called the South Royalton Green, which is, as we say, it's our commons. It's a beautiful sort of green. Oh, I guess actually we'll see it in a future photo. So I'll hold on. Here's just a program that happened. Actually, this has happened just prior to COVID. I think it was a late January of 2 years ago. So this is sort of a common activity. The Commons itself had hosted pre-COVID about 160 events per year. It's a small space. It's basically a large single room. But obviously, as you see on the walls, it's a nice space for art. So there was always regular rotating art exhibits going on the walls. But of course, the primary focus was on the community work that was happening. And this is a gathering where people are talking about building resilience hubs in their communities. So this was an invitation to a wider region of people active in community work in other towns in Vermont to come together. And this is simply a breakout session where people sort of broke into groups to share. The village of South Royalton is also home to the Vermont Law School, which is the only law school in Vermont. It's actually sort of recognized in the US as one of the leading environmental law schools. And this is one of the programs, because the law school students in particular, this is the Black Law Student Society at the law school doing a presentation in our space. And the intention, of course, because the law school, the students love to bring things into the community. And the identity of having a community space like the Commons was attractive to them. There's the green out there. Or at least you can see a little bit of the edge of the green. It goes over to the left. It's a pretty large green. And on the right that you can't quite see is many other downtown storefront buildings. I guess that's all I got to say about that. But it's a beautiful green outside in fact, there it is. So this is one of the things, this is actually one of the events that we did. It was called Growing Local Fest, and this is green. This location where this man is presenting an invasives workshop outdoors on the green is directly across the street from the Commons, and then the background is the tent for other programs and actually sort of undercover stuff in case. Well, since it's usually in June, it's either for keeping the rain out or actually a year where it was too hot and it was great to be under the tent for that. I think, is that it? I think, yeah.
Yeah, that's all the photos we've got. I think you told me once before that initially the town government, I don't know if you have a select board there, but the select board was reluctant to let you use the green for activities like that. Is that the case?
Yes, yeah, that's the case. Yes, the select board, when we first sort of moved into town, was perhaps a little more conservative and cautious about community activity in terms of you might say, using their precious green to have community activity on it. That has pretty quickly faded away. If we want to chalk up one good thing to COVID, or there's probably others, but one good thing was when COVID hit, the green really turned into the commons. And we, it's sort of lovely to talk about what the commons means, because the select board, the town fathers, were reserving it for only certain kinds of things. And they quickly realized that this place could actually be the space where people could hang out. And so the early phase of the commons, the early phase of the pandemic, when everybody sort of needed to be outside and things were closed down, the space became really almost like a beautiful large community space, with, and obviously a little weather dependent, but it does, the commons does have a very large gazebo on it that can hold maybe close to 100 people under cover. So, year round. So anyway, yes, the story has changed, and the commons, the green, is now used much more in such a way as the commons here, the space that I'm in, has been used over the years.
Yeah. And which brings me to the question of why you decided to call your space the Commons in the first place. There's a long history that's associated with that term, and I'm wondering what you had in mind when you chose that name.
Well, it's to reclaim, our need to have communal spaces for the people who live in community. I mean, it's tied, of course, to the ever shrinking privatization of property and away from even the early settlers, the earliest people. I grew up around Boston, and the Boston Commons was widely known, in our little bit of history, as the place where people brought their cows and grazed, and it was even in the early age of sort of getting privatizing or getting into private property and that kind of thing. There were these vast spaces in communities that were the commons. So this was the intention of calling this the Commons, was to sort of reclaim this space. And this space we've now been in for 8 years, and we never charge anything for the use of this space for anybody for any purpose. And everybody in town can come and, obviously sometimes calendar conflicts, but this space can be used by anyone, with the caveat, of course, now with COVID, especially here in Vermont right now, being quite extremely bad, we have limited access.
Yeah. I think you said 8 years of having that space, but BALE was around for a few years before that. And I'm curious to know how that changed BALE to have a public space like that. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe you were doing exactly the same things, but you just added a public space to your repertoire. Just curious whether it affected your work in a broader sense.
I would say yes, I think it did. Not conscious, not planned. it was, I think, initially to be connected to in a town, in a location that was central to the watershed. And when we initially sort of thought about the organization, when we were thinking a watershed, 14 towns, that seemed like, okay, we can do localization activity in in a bunch of towns. That was what happened when we opened the Commons. Was, at least in my mind, things got even more hyper local, but more deeply grounded in a location, in a place. So it became ever more logical that we were here in this town. And of course, because commerce and community expand in these kind of small communities beyond this particular town, but largely we were sort of grounded in place, and so that shrunk our thinking about what we need to do, like further away, but also more deeply connected in the needs of this particular community.
Yeah. I imagine that some of the people listening are people who might be interested in trying to create their own community space wherever they are. And one of the obstacles I'm sure that everyone is aware of is the cost. And you told me, when we spoke briefly yesterday, you told me a story that I really loved about your landlord and the rent. So maybe you can share that with everybody.
Well, we went looking. I guess it was just me. I mean, it was us, but it was me walking around and saying, "Oh, there's an open. It's got a for rent sign." So I went to this location, and the landlord said the rent was $650 per month, which for around here was a pretty typical, I think, rent. And so initially we negotiated down to $600 a month rent. So for the first year, we were paying $600 a month. And I don't forget the exact time frame, whether it was 1 or 2 years, but 2 years after that, when he saw what BALE and what we were doing in the community, he said he wanted to reduce the rent to $500 a month. So now for the past 6 or 7 years, we are paying $500 a month. So because he believed so much in what we were doing and what we brought to the community and the values, that we presented in the community, he was wanted to support us in that way.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's one of the huge advantages of being, grounded in a place, but also having your landlord grounded in the same place, because they're not only recognizing the value of what you do, I think, but there's a social value to them, I think, in being connected with you. Right. So that does give you some, as long as you don't have an absentee landlord, there's the right. possibility that you'll have a good relationship based on the kind of work you do.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on. If people have questions about community space, we'll get to them at the end, but at this juncture, let's move on to the multi-sector localization efforts you do. And you mentioned community radio being cited there for a while, which is something I'd forgotten about. But you were working on a lot of fronts at once. And so if you could fill us in on exactly what you're doing, it'd be great. Well,
we really sort of, when we started, I think it was a singular focus, and that was on food systems, getting local food, because we had all these farms in the area, new farms coming in where, at least, I mean, historically in Vermont, when I came to Vermont 50 years ago, it was almost all dairy. So it was monoculture, largely a monoculture kind of all dairy interest, dairy farms. And in the past decade or two, it has sharply shifted away from dairy because dairy no longer becomes viable because of the big, gigantic dairy conglomerate farms that are out in the Midwest and the far West. So dairy is dying both economically, but in has come more diversified farms, organic farms, much more youth-oriented young farmers moving into the area. And we wanted just to get good food into the local school. So that's really where we started. And that was probably the first year or two. But it was quite obvious to me as I became more aware of just what food systems are. Of course, it's very clear to start making all the links between energy, transportation, all of the pieces of what an economy is are all interconnected. And so if we could scale down the things that we can do, and the intention, of course, being, the intention is, or the knowledge is, okay, we're heading into a great collapse of either through climate, through economics, through even now some of the sort of the right-wing fascist themes that are pervading here in the United States and in other places around the world. The more that we're resilient in our own community, the better off we will be going forward. So with that mindset, picking and choosing and things that we could work on and inspiring small groups to get started. So the radio station was an early on project that sort of immediately followed on the heels of the focus on food in the schools. But of course, we were doing locally grown guides, which we've done for a number of years, just to get people aware of where their farms are, that they can access their farms. Over the last 10 years, the burgeoning sort of awareness of local food, has probably led the way here, in particular in Vermont. But we had one intentional gathering about 7 or 8 years ago, where we did a long series with topics from energy to local investment to transportation to environment to youth leadership. And out of that came a whole bunch of sort of ideas where people sort of took and ran with them. So, and the role that BALE played was to be supportive, sometimes, significantly supportive, but sometimes the leadership in these groups carried forward, fully on their own. About 5 or 6 years ago, we started this thing called the White River Investment Club, which is a group of local people, 25 or 26 local people who pool their money and then invest in local projects. So just like a little sort of a micro lending program where where we get to invest in community projects that we believe in. So primarily they've gone to farms for equipment. We just, a butchery just opened up in Royalton. So, and she needed a smoker. So $30,000 to her for a smoker, so small scale, $10,000 to $50,000 lent here. We're just in conversation with someone who's trying to reopen a general store in Tunbridge, which is the neighboring town that I live in. So to invest in that kind of thing. And we have, on the other hand, we've built a community solar project that there's 23 homes and one general store that draw their power from that 150 kilowatt array that finally just opened in November after much resistance from our state. We for quite a while, up until COVID, and even when we were able to get outside, we had this thing called Resilience University, which is just totally hands-on, everything, learning skills for the new future economy, the localized economy. So everything from saving seeds to darning socks to food preparation and that kind of thing. We have a fabulous community garden that we support that's just down the road that provides food for both the local food shelf, but we also opened up right out front here the 24-hour food pantry that's open for everybody to use 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I should emphasize in terms of, okay, people saying, oh, well, how do you do this, or how can we bring this? All these ideas were stolen from somebody else. I mean, not stolen. I mean, they were taken, It's like, oh, there's a good idea. Let's try that. So it's not, it's not rocket science. It's a year ago, we started the White River Time Exchange. And actually, I remember, I'm looking at Steve now. Many years ago, Steve and I worked in Montpelier to create an alternative currency that was a currency. And we decided that that experience actually impacted the choice between whether we were to do to do our own dollars or to do the time exchange, which of course is much more manageable and doesn't involve the IRS, which is the Internal Revenue Service, getting on our tail. So we have started a time exchange. So many of these projects are just happening, thriving, or not, or maybe not thriving, and some is, like I would say here at the Commons, is not thriving as well because of COVID. So yes, we are impacted for sure by some of the things have been significantly impacted by the pandemic.
Yeah, we've gotten one question that maybe you can answer quickly from Phyllis, who wants to know what the radio station is. And is it essentially a pirate station, or is it a licensed station, or?
It's a licensed, it's called a low power station. So, which is, it's 100 watts. That's, I don't know the technicalities, but I know the output of, the broadcast. It's a 100-watt transmitter, which means it does not go that far. But so it's based here in Royalton, just up on the hill, the transmitter, and it touches maybe 5 or 6 towns in the area. And it's called Royalton Community Radio. It's WFVR, or as they label themselves, Free Vermont Radio. And it is at 96.5 FM if you want to, if you're close enough to South Royalton.
It's interesting because, you know, in the localization action guide, we have a section on media, and it seems as though these low power stations like this were licensed for a while, and that now the window has closed on new licenses. I'm not sure why, but it's one of those things that I think people, if they are interested in community radio, real genuine community radio like this station, they need to let their elected representatives know that it's not okay to prevent these low power, very local stations from getting licensed.
Right. Yes. I mean, so here we're speaking about the Commons again. The Commons is our airway, is our air. Exactly. That's our air. And it should belong to us. It actually, WFDR was one of the last, as you just said, you know, they sort of closed it down, but this was in the last pool that was opened up by Obama. So right at the tail end of the Obama years is when they were able to sort of get their license.
Yeah. Let's get to some more questions from the participants. Irma from California wants to know how BALE is funded and how many people you have on staff. She says that one challenge she faces is that everyone expects this work to be done by volunteers, which excludes working adults, youth, or anyone who does not have discretionary income or ample daytime leisure time. How do you convince people that this work is valuable and that people need to be treated as professionals and compensated fairly?
Yeah, there's a tough one. I mean, the easy part is this. Right now, there's one person who makes up BALE, and you're looking at him. Sometimes there's been one other person. And that comes and goes, but we're actually in a phase organizationally where we're trying to get away from the hierarchy of a director founder. That's me, you know, so to try and remove that concept to actually, you know, sort of be in the United States. I've learned, as one who has been involved in nonprofit world for decades, the nonprofit structure and the requirements of the IRS and the requirements of our capitalist system to make money, dollars, dollars, as opposed to food, sharing transportation. I mean, there's all kinds of possibilities for people to get compensated, our time exchange. There's all kinds of possibilities for getting creative around that. So going back to what we just had our nonprofit board meeting last night and looking at our budget for the coming year and actually wanting to compensate people for specific projects. So in other words, in the past, I can say that for the most part, we've asked the volunteers to create these projects that I've been mentioning, you know, running a resilience university. The community solar project was just completely lucky because we're connected to the law school is across the street. And they have a thing called the Energy Clinic, and students at the Energy Clinic, as part of their coursework, actually need to learn the law, the law for building a community solar project. So I guess with the community solar, we're a little bit lucky and unique in that way, but just finding those resources. So anyway, we want to sort of get I would love to sort of not be the director and writing, doing the administrative stuff, but sharing that amongst pools, other people who have specific projects. This past year, we did actually do that to some extent with the 3 women who run the community garden. So we funded that as sort of a freestanding project and paid them, a wage, for doing that. So we want to do more of that sort of horizontal structure. Also tied into the question was where we get our money from. There are very few grants that we get. And our intention that we talked about 2 years ago is to become entirely supported by donations from the community. And this year I can say our total budget is $80,000 per year. And it's fluctuated up over 100 or in some years. And our intention is to reduce that down and to be able to get all our money from community members. And that won't happen instantly, but we will also want to get creative around how to compensate people in other ways other than US dollars. And, not a simple, in some ways I think I'm giving a flip answer, because it's not that easy. But that's where we're wanting to head.
Brad Johnston actually had a bunch of questions about your budget and that sort of thing, which you've answered. But he also asked how many people are on your board, whether you have membership, and if so, how many people?
When we organized back 10, 11 years ago, we chose not to be a membership organization. We've actually popped up at that idea of sort of becoming a membership organization in terms of our nonprofit status, because those are sort of the 2 typical directions you can go to. And we've had that conversation back and forth. I don't know, I guess I don't have a bias one way or the other. But in the past, in my years before doing BALE, every organization that I was involved with was a membership organization. So in some ways, this was unique in that way. I also think, because we just sort of went through our fundraising year, the end of the year appeal and the fundraising. And so we were able to raise close to $40,000 this year so in other words, so now look at your, that goal of getting to entirely locally funded. So we're basically halfway there, which means the other money has come from foundations. Actually, we haven't received a grant in almost a year, and we're not seeking grants at this point. Or we haven't sought grants. So what else was, Brad? What was in that? I can't remember.
How big your board is?
Oh, the board. So the board is small. The board is 6 of us. And we have consciously sort of kept it to what I would call a small, typically, or atypically, maybe smaller than many. But we are, again, I think, I like to think that the nonprofit structure that we need to move toward more relational rather than transactional kinds of relationships in the way we work together. So our board are, I call them my friends. We do much more than come to a board meeting once a month or subcommittees, committees that go and meet even every other week. That we are sort of neighbors and community members and like to have that kind of relationship as we sort of move to dispersing sort of this hierarchical structure that is typical of nonprofits. And of course, because we are so embedded in community, or we have become, are becoming, not yet, but really sort of connected here. I think that's the important goal, is to really to start creating those kinds of relationships as opposed to a sort of a classic, transactional relationship that most boards and most of capitalism, is.
Yep, exactly. It's interesting because there's a question from someone in France, JKT, I'm not sure their full name, but they say, I live in France where there are community hubs, often in rural areas, called tiers-lieux, which translates to third places. They are often supported by local government and are part of a nationwide organization. In addition to meeting rooms, they often include cafes and co-working spaces, plus occasionally small businesses like grocers. And they're wondering if there's any national organization or effort like this in the US promoting this kind of space. I'm not actually aware of that from a government level, but unless you have something to add, I think check out the action guide and the community space section on that, and there may be some additional information. I can't recall off the top of my head whether there are efforts to promote that sort of thing, but it seems more likely in a place like France than in a place like the US, where the sort of where governments are being sort of systematically starved of funding by everything from offshoring to the costs of cleaning up after corporate malfeasance. So the governments don't have a lot of discretionary funding for good things like that. They're sort of scrambling to deal with an opioid epidemic and polluted waterways and everything else that's a product of this exploitive economic system we have. So yeah, check out the action guide, and there may be some hints of that either in the US or elsewhere. Yeah. Katie is asking how has BALE expanded during COVID? You mentioned that the Commons hasn't been used as much during the pandemic, but what has expanded?
Well, when we were actually, this location was, and when the pandemic hit, we were the first to create a mutual aid group response to immediately get food into people's hands, because it's sort of, here in the United States, it sort of went into an immediate lockdown. So people needed food delivered to their doors. Early on, they needed wood for heat, or whatever, all kinds of services. So we set up a mutual aid, and the result of the mutual aid over these 2 years is we now have this thing, not year round because it's too cold and snowy right now, but we have a thing called the free store. So we have out front of directly in front of the building is enough space that we actually have a weekly through November. We stopped in November and we'll pick up again in probably April. a free store, which is just a large free swap store. That emerged out of this mutual aid effort to make sure people had clothes, or or simply swapping as opposed to buying new stuff. Here was a place to swap, or I mean, you didn't have to swap. You could come and get it. You could come and, I mean, we obviously we were somewhat selective. We don't have endless space to put things in, but and then the free food pantry was another response from that. In terms of the commons space, what was just mentioned as a co-work space, the commons has now become much more of a co-work space based on time. In other words, we don't have different people can use it on different days. And there's a big effort in Vermont to, it's called the Every Town Project, where we're trying for, in terms of reparations, it wants to acknowledge that every single town in the state of Vermont is offer up a piece of land, of space, sort of symbolic reparations act, to have a piece of land turned over to Black or Indigenous people in the state. And so the people who work on that come in here on Thursdays. I come in here, well, I'm here on, here we are on Thursday, but I'm here on sort of special reprieve from that group, but who are normally here on Thursdays. But so different people use it on different days. So sort of a co-work space in that way. And we have agreed that we can have a max of 2 people, both on sort of opposite sides of the room.
There's a number of questions, or actually they're more like comments from somebody, and a lot of them refer to the public trust, which is not a, it's a capital P and capital T, and it seems to be a concept that is believed relevant to what you're doing, but I'm not familiar with it. Is it something you know about?
No.
He does say that we may be following legal advice not to talk about it, but I don't think, but I should let you know that that's not the case. We're not following any legal advice whatsoever here. So here's a question again from Brad Johnston. Are there co-ops in your area, and what do you think about their functionality?
Yeah. Co-ops are essential. Co-ops are definitely where we need to go. I'm looking out the window at our local thriving food co-op, which is actually, it's the food, it is the food store. Well, actually there's a little quick stop at the gas station, but no, it is the food cooperative where everybody in this area, in this close-in area, gets their food, because you have to drive a distance to get to a commercial supermarket, and it's a great it's a great co-op, and that model needs to be advanced and promoted, both through our investment club, supporting efforts, at supporting the development of co-ops. And I think, well, at the conference that I'm remembering the conference that Local Futures and BALE and others did a couple of years ago, there was a great session on co-ops and how to get one started. And in Vermont, it's called the Vermont. I'm not remembering, but there's a statewide organization that helps co-ops get started.
Yeah. Here's a tough question to answer. It's a question that people ask of Local Futures quite a bit, and it's a hard one to answer. But Alex wants to know if you could give us a broad sense of the overall impacts BALE has been able to have so far, for example, in shifting the food system towards local and organic, place-based sustainable livelihoods created, local decentralized renewable energy, et cetera, et cetera. And also whether there is any support from the Vermont government for these efforts.
The answer to the last part is no. And we actually would not make a big effort to seek that, because that's really not, that's not our priority. And of course, so to measure that kind of data is difficult. I can tell you lots of stories of people who have come in here over the years who say, you know what, because you're here, I'm moving here, and they're young people who want to start a farm, or they, they see a town with thriving activity happening. And so obviously we're just a small part of that. And so the collective impact of the other things that happen in this community, I can say that this building, our dear landlord who gave us the reduced rent, sold the building in December. And the new owners came in and it was like, oh no. And I should say that the landlord, who got 17 offers on the building, rejected any offers where people wanted to take the storefront, our space, for a bakery or some other thing. The previous landlord wanted us to be here, so he was defending and telling anybody who was interested that the BALE really and the Commons had to stay there. I mean, obviously, once he sold the building, he couldn't, but that was his goal. And the new owners came in and said, this is such a thriving town. That's why we bought this building, is because we can see what you're doing, and we can, as a piece, not just us, but as a piece of this sort of thriving town with a food co-op. I mean, we do have a law school, which is obviously a financially stabilizing factor, but that's, so collective, total collective impact, where I know we're making a difference.
And related to that, Brad would like to know if you have a sense of what you'd like to accomplish in the next couple of years, considering what's required post-COVID.
Brad's asking the hard questions. I mean, I think, sort of what I just talked about is sort of the horizontal, sort of becoming more of getting away from the classic structures. We've been drawn, I don't know if people know about sociocracy for all, but there's a sociocratic method that is much more democratic and less hierarchical in how organizations can work. So bringing some of those skills into how we operate to be more horizontal, to actually support, I think the one word that I use about BALE is nimble. So what's, like the mutual aid, we were the first place in the state to say, pop, you got a big nonprofit organization. They're slow and lumbering. I mean, think about giant corporations, think about, the federal government, they can move, they can't move. So we can be responsive. So I think that's, being nimble to what's needed in the community at the time.
Yeah. And then I guess related to the COVID question is whether you've organized community online events during the COVID period. This is from Lowell.
We did organize some, especially early on. And then and this was sort of I guess you would say more of my instinct was there was such amazing other resources available that were going online to do the same kinds of things. We do specific local, local efforts around, with organizing right now, one around on sort of the climate and how the state of Vermont is really bluffing their way through trying to account for their greenhouse gases, and it's a shell game. And so we're organizing a seminar, a webinar around that. But largely, I've been pointing people to great online programs that other people are already doing that very much align with, our work.
Yeah. Elizabeth would like to know what the gender mix and age range of people most actively involved. This is a question that I always, it's true for local futures when we've done public events that we find there's a good gender mix, but there is not a good age mix usually. There's a lot of gray hairs in the audience, and I'm curious to know whether that's true for BALE as well.
Right. So I can tell you the only thing that we've mentioned the past year and a half is we have to find a male for the board.
Really?
So we have an all-female board, and their average age is, I think we averaged out 32. So there's 20, there's 25, 26, 31, 40 something, and then a 50-year-old.
Yeah, the local futures board is also all women, but not a very good, I don't think I would want to tell you what the average age is. Let's see. Blaze would like to know, for a new group forming in a similar way to BALE, which of the projects that you developed successfully would you say would make good early projects, ones that a group might want to develop first?
Well, without knowing your community and location, it's a little hard to predict. I mean, maybe the space, the place to come together is the way to do it. It's a little hard to say. I mean, it was pretty obvious when we got started that food and food systems here in an agricultural area, and at that point, a sort of quickly growing awareness around better food and and organic and that kind of thing, that was obvious for us, and that may be the same, but it's hard to say, because not knowing exactly where you are.
Yeah. Helena Norberg Hodge, who's the director of Local Futures, always feels that food is the first place to begin. That it's the place that can have the biggest impact immediately on the short term, and it's also the most important because it's something that everybody everywhere, doesn't matter where that question came from, people there eat food every day, and so you can have an impact both on the environment, on people's health, on livelihoods by focusing on food. So that's what I would suggest. Let's see. Brad would also, this is not a difficult question from Brad. He'd like to know if there's any online references for how the investment club works.
Ooh, good. Well, you can certainly Google White River Investment Club and you'll get their website.
Okay. And also there's probably some links in the localization action guide on local investing, so you can check that out as well. Martin would like to know what your experience shows are the main ways to change good intentions and expansive discussion into personal and community action.
Uh, are we going to end on a tough one? No, we don't need to end. Yeah, I mean, I speak for myself on this one. You know, I'm still working hard at being, you know, sort of being a whole person and really trying to, you know, sort of, I have a close friend who's Sherry Mitchell, who's a Penobscot elder and wisdom holder, author of Sacred Instructions, living, what's it called? Living Sacred Instructions. I'm not remembering the subtitle, but being with her, being with Indigenous people and Indigenous wisdom. I'm actually just signed up for a course which Steve might be familiar with, called Surviving the Future, that Sterling College is doing. So it's deepening my own work and really, and then, you know, that's what I can do. And hopefully that sort of personal commitment can exude out from from me and to others. And, you know, we sort of share our hearts, you know, especially in this time where we really need to do exactly those kinds of things.
Yeah. Well, we're over time already, so I'm just going to end with one easier question from Brad, and he'd like to know if there are authors and thinkers you particularly like that guide your work.
Yeah, well, I just mentioned Sherry Mitchell. I go, the things that I read consistently are resilience.org. I read, you know, those. I read, you know, Local Futures. I am, you know, I think the book and the work of Sean Chamberlain and David Fleming, the Surviving the Future, is, you know, is great tools for, you know, what's ahead. The Sherry Mitchell stuff is more spiritual and recognizing your trauma, and, you know, sort of facing, you know, what you need to learn. And Sherry Mitchell is particularly good because she's an Indigenous woman, but the work that she does, she invites white people to listen and hear, not participate, but to actually witness the depth and the breadth of what Indigenous wisdom can teach us, especially white folk here, about how to live on the planet.
Well,
Steve,
yeah.
Before we close out, I'm just wondering if we can get to Alan's question, since he's been waiting pretty patiently, and perhaps loop this discussion around to the very beginning when you and Chris were discussing your context in Vermont. So he's wondering if there's any history in your small communities in Vermont of relocalization as transition towns or networks, mentioning that he's been involved in similar situations in England. So I just wanted to make sure that got out there.
So the question is around other relocalization efforts.
Yes.
You know, Bale is sort of like a transition town. There are other small. I mean, in Vermont, there, you know, which is really sort of the area that I know, there are transition towns. From what I can tell, they're sort of less active. Can I say that? Likely less active. You know, I don't want to short shrift, you know, things that may be happening. But there's things neighboring to us close by. There's a thing called Sustainable Woodstock, which is, so there are other organizations like Transition Towns, like BALE, which I could happily identify, as a transition town without the transition town label, and other organizations that are doing similar kinds of things.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say that I would agree with you that there are a few, like Montpelier, for example, has a transition town group, but they've never, as far as I know, they haven't approached it as systematically as BALE has and on as many fronts and with the same kind of commitment. It's almost, yeah, there's a level of commitment that BALE has that I think is lacking from the other efforts that I'm aware of. It's possible that there are other efforts in Vermont that I don't know about, but I think BALE is really the gold standard when it comes to what you're trying to accomplish and what you have accomplished. So, and I apologize, Alan, for missing that question. I am not the best at monitoring the chat and the Q&A at the same time as I'm trying to listen. If there's anything you'd like to add, Chris, to what you've already said?
Yeah, I mean, I can just say in the process of sort of doing what I call intersectional work and sort of highlighting that and really highlighting the emphasis on localization. It's a piece of work that's important to do. I mean, which is why, of course, I love Local Futures, because they're they are for me anyway, one of a very few sort of wider voices for speaking up on that. But I know even in my community and even doing this kind of work and being visible and being supported and people donating, that they actually they're not at the level where they're really deeply understanding how all of us need to shift our consumption. I call it culture. It's a culture shift that we really need to absorb in our hearts and our minds, and that's I guess the most important thing for me to be focusing on and wanting, to sort of learn how to talk to even my friends and my peers in a sort of heart-based way about how we need to shift the way we live.
Yeah. I mean, I'd like to just point out the converse of what you said about Local Futures, because we at Local Futures look at what BALE is doing as the perfect hyper-local version of what we're trying to promote on a larger scale. And you're touching every base there is really around what needs to be localized, how we need to become more place-based, and you're walking the walk. You're really taking the theory to heart and putting it into practice in a very meaningful way. So I've really appreciated seeing what BALE is doing over the years, and it's always been good work. So I want to thank you for doing that. All right, thank you everybody for participating, and I hope it was as worthwhile for you as it was for us.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks
Bye,
all.
Chris.
Yep. Bye-bye.